Here's where we are in the governance series. We completed phase 1, seeing the system, letters 1 to 12. We are in phase 2, designing the system, letters 13 to 30. We completed stage 1, entering design, letters 13A and 13B. We completed stage 2, stabilizing the core, letters 14 to 17. We are in stage 3, seeing clearly, letters 18 to 20. We just completed letter 20A, when procedures are in place and problems still persist. We are in letter 20B, the 4 layers operating beneath the surface. Letter 20A introduced the observation that governance conditions layer, that structural patterns do not operate independently, that they interweave and amplify each other, and that addressing one without seeing the others produces a resolution that is temporary. The VP of Sales story was introduced as containing not one governance condition, but 4, operating simultaneously. This letter examines each layer, not because they arrived in sequence, they did not, but because understanding each one individually is what makes it possible to see how they operated together, and to recognize which layer may be operating in your organization right now. The first layer, the signal that went out but did not land. The board designed a governance mechanism. They communicated it downward. The VP of Sales intercepted it publicly in a board meeting by naming it as inefficient and unnecessary. The salespeople received the interception as a counter directive from the person who controlled their employment. The governance signal from the board did not reach the ground. The mechanism that prevented it from landing was operating openly in the boardroom in front of the people who had designed the signal. The governance structure had no design mechanism to detect when a downward directive was being deliberately redirected, or to protect the signal's integrity as it passed through the authority layers that carried it. This is not the condition of a signal that was ignored. It is the condition of a signal that was actively intercepted in plain sight by someone whose informal authority over the people below him was more immediate than the formal authority of the board above him. The efficiency argument the VP offered was plausible. That plausibility was the interception mechanism. It provided cover for what was actually happening, and the governance structure had no designed way to look beneath the surface logic to distinguish between a legitimate operational concern and a deliberate obstruction of organizational visibility. The design question this layer raises: does your governance structure have a mechanism to confirm that a directive sent from the board or executive level arrived at the ground with the clarity it was intended to carry? Or does the organization assume arrival and discover otherwise only when the consequence of non-arrival becomes visible? Second layer, authority shadowing operating at a higher level. Authority shadowing was introduced in letter 8 of this series. In letter 8, the focus was on the pattern itself, what it is and how it operates. In this letter, the focus is on what authority shadowing does to governance communication when it operates at the level between board and ground. The VP had built an informal authority structure, so deeply embedded in the sales team's dependence and, as became clear later, their fear, that this counter-directive carried more immediate consequence than the board's directive. He had made himself appear structurally indispensable, not through genuine value that could be evaluated, measured, and compared, through opacity, through ensuring that what he knew, what he held, and what he controlled was visible to no one but himself. The efficiency argument was the surface. The control mechanism was underneath. And the governance structure had no mechanism for distinguishing between the two. The result was a split signal environment. The people at the ground were not confused about what to do. They were entirely clear. They followed the authority with the most immediate consequence for their employment, which was not the board. When the governance structure is designed so that no single person can make themselves appear indispensable through opacity, that dynamic changes. Informal authority can no longer redirect formal signals without a mechanism to surface the redirection. The design question this layer raises: does your governance structure have a mechanism to detect when informal authority is redirecting a formal governance signal? Or does the structure assume that what was sent is what was received? The third layer: the executive who recognized the condition and could not act. The CEO knew. He saw the interception happening. He understood what the VP of sales was doing, and he did not act. This is not a character observation. It is a structural one. The CEO recognized the condition and calculated that acting carried greater organizational risk than tolerating. That calculation was produced by a governance structure that had allowed one person to make himself appear indispensable through opacity and fear. The CEO assessed that confronting the VP might cause the sales team to leave with him, and the loss of the sales force appeared more consequential than the loss of governance visibility. The calculation was rational within the structure as it existed. The governance design had no mechanism for breaking that dynamic while the CEO held the authority to act. In many organizations, one person holds the majority of shares and voting rights. While that person is present and willing to act, governance functions through their authority. When that person is unwilling to act, or when circumstances transfer that authority to a collective body for the first time, the organization discovers whether anything was designed to function independently of that single point of control. In many cases, very little was. The CEO was not operating in isolation from the measurement system. The VP of sales was producing growth. The numbers were real. The board saw growth and interpreted it as confirmation that the governance structure was functioning adequately. What no one was measuring, because no one had designed a mechanism to measure it, was the distance between the growth being produced and the growth that was possible if the conditions the VP had created were removed. This is the question that had never been asked in that boardroom. It is the question that belongs in every strategic review, every governance assessment, every performance conversation. Great compared to what? 5% annual growth looks like success when the measurement confirms it, and nothing surfaces what full performance would look like. It is only after the condition is removed that the organization can see what it had been measuring as success was adequate performance inside a structure that had been suppressing what was achievable. After the VP was removed, the numbers moved, not because the market changed, because the structure constraining what was possible had been addressed. This is metric distortion operating at the strategic level. The measurement was accurate. The picture was incomplete, and the incompleteness was structural, produced not by a misconfigured dashboard, but by a deliberate governance condition that ensured the full picture was never captured. The design questions this layer raises: is your governance structure designed to function when the person with the authority to act has calculated that acting carries greater organizational risk than tolerating? And is there a mechanism to surface the distance between current performance and what full performance would look like if the conditions operating beneath the measurement were addressed? What would your organization's performance look like if those conditions were removed? And do you have a designed mechanism for surfacing that distance before it disappears with the person who created it? The fourth layer: what became visible after? When the board finally acted, the full picture became visible. The salespeople had been living in constant fear. They had been caught between two authorities with no designed pathway for surfacing what they were experiencing. The VP had been managing through fear rather than through the governance structure the organization had designed. None of that was visible in the board meetings, because the person responsible for making it visible was the person creating it. This connects directly to the third invisibility mechanism from letter 18C. Naming the gap carries consequence. The salespeople who could have surfaced what was happening had the most to lose by surfacing it. The consequence for naming this gap was not professional discomfort. It was potential job loss at the hands of the person being named. The silence was structural, not personal. When a new board member arrived, someone who had not been conditioned by the fear structure, someone who could see clearly because they had not been inside what had normalized the condition, the signal that the organization needed to act on became actionable for the first time. That is signal translation design operating at the board level. The signal had been present for years. It became readable only when someone with the authority to act on it arrived in a position where the distortion of fear was not present. These 4 layers did not operate sequentially. They operated simultaneously. Each one made the others hard to see and hard to address. And removing the VP addressed the immediate expression of each condition without resolving any of the structural conditions that allowed them to develop. The authority concentration that prevented board action remained. The measurement system that had never been designed to surface the distance between actual and possible performance remained. The absence of independent escalation pathways remained. The fear environment had been named, but the governance design that would prevent it from developing again had not yet been built. What this means for your organization. Organizations that have invested in governance frameworks, reporting systems, and decision authority structures sometimes discover that the conditions they designed responses for have not been resolved. They have shifted. A new person holds the informal authority. A different function controls the measurement. A different leadership transition has separated accountability from outcome. The pattern was addressed. The structural conditions that produce it were not. 3 questions are worth bringing into a leadership conversation, not as a diagnostic applied from the outside, but as a starting point for a conversation the organization may not yet have had the language to have. When a governance directive travels from the board or executive level downward through the organization, is there a design mechanism for confirming it arrived at the ground with the clarity it was intended to carry? Or does the organization assume arrival and discover otherwise only when the consequence of non-arrival becomes visible? For the governance conditions your organization has addressed in the past 2 to 3 years, were the interdependencies between those conditions mapped before the design responses were finalized? Or was each condition addressed independently without designing for what the resolution of one condition might reveal or transfer to another? Is there a question your organization asks in every strategic review that surfaces the distance between current performance and what full performance would look like if the conditions operating beneath the surface were addressed? Not just are we growing, but great compared to what? What would your organization's performance look like if the conditions beneath the current measurement were removed? And do you have a design mechanism for surfacing that distance before it disappears with the person who created it? Organizations that find these questions easy to answer with specificity and confidence tend to be designing for the system rather than for the symptoms. For those where the answers are less immediate, the patterns operating in your organization may be more layered than any single governance response has yet addressed. The VP of sales was removed, the numbers moved, and the organization discovered that what it had been measuring as success was adequate performance inside a structure that had been constraining what was achievable. Removing the VP was the beginning. Designing for the conditions that allowed him to operate that way for years was the work that followed. The organization that designs for the relationships between patterns, not just the patterns themselves, stops being surprised by its own system. It begins to see the layering before a single layer becomes an exposure. That is what becomes possible on the other side of governance layering. And that work is what stage 4 is designed to support. Stage 3 is complete. The governance structure built in stage 2 now has the visibility mechanisms designed to tell it whether what was built is holding, whether the right data is being captured, whether the right question is being answered, whether the signal traveling upward can be received and read by the people who need to act on it, whether the accountability structure is designed to keep decision and consequence together, and whether the signal traveling downward arrives with the clarity it was intended to carry. Stage 3 has also left the reader with something more important than any individual design response. It has left the reader with the question that stage 4 is built to answer. If governance conditions layer, if they interweave and amplify each other and shift expression when any single one is addressed, what does it mean to design a governance response that holds, not just for the visible pattern, but for the relationships between the patterns operating beneath it? Stage 4, from activity to coherence, does not introduce new patterns to identify. It asks what it means to design governance that holds together as an integrated system rather than a collection of individual responses to individual conditions. That is where the next letter begins. Thank you.